Where do we start?
Where do we start? Gosh, it's tiring.
I know what I'm thinking. I watched your movie again today. I mentioned this.
Yeah.
And it was a hard viewing for me. I mean, I think it's an extraordinary film. I mean, I can't even articulate how much I admire it, but it was especially hard for me. And there were just certain things in it that were hitting me harder than normal, maybe because I just performed last night, I don't know. And so a couple of that I wanted to ask, which I don't need to jump in too seriously right away, but at the very end, when you're sort of appropriating a kind of imagined voice of your brother, and you specifically mention the idea that in a way the whole family was killed. And that just really, really affected me, and really, I found really powerful, because it's the thing that I have been the most terrified of about the piece that I've been working on, that my family somehow killed another family. I don't know, just something I thought about when I was watching it.
Yeah, that moment actually was an imagined, because I didn't have access to, autopsy photos or the grand jury minutes or any of the actual meat of the investigation. And because I had never had a chance, I didn't have a chance to experience my brother's loss with my parents and my sister. I found out about it 12 hours later, and essentially it took me 24 hours to get home. And that moment when I'm lying on the ground at the garage where he was killed, and sort of performing what I imagine were his final moments, I sort of go into this conversation with him, and it came, directly out of a lot of writing that I did throughout the process, and including the edit. And it just, I tried to articulate both the things that I thought he would be realizing based on the nature of the wound, and also the things that he would never know. And because, of patriarchal, just sort of continuation of families, and the whole thing about your name, being passed down. And there's I'll get to a different story about my family name maybe later in the conversation, but I don't intend to have children, and I don't know what my sister's plans are. But it was the moment where I needed to say all of the things that had been said, over the years, right? Like my mother desperately wanting grandchildren. My mother knew that my brother wanted a family. And I also knew that, my own faith, right, was and is in flux, right? And so the line about there not being, that there may be no heaven, there may only be the ground, was a way of, for me, having the story land where I knew it landed, which was literally on the ground, where he fell. And some people think that I'm trying to speak as him, and don't realize that I'm actually speaking to him. And it was important for me, I think, to have that at the end of the film, because I do so much learning about him through his journals, and the whole crazy, starvation diet he went on in an attempt to get a good job. And it was just one of those things that just sort of, it didn't come out of nowhere, but it came out of a very deep longing for a conversation I never got to have with him. I think it's one of the most powerful moments in the film. It certainly is for me. When I hear the sort of the sound design deliberately drop out from underneath my voice, and say there may only be the ground. For me, that's the moment when I know the film is over.
Okay.
Um, and I can't imagine being where you are and asking the questions that you're asking of your own family and wrestling with the not knowing what happened to the families of the man who died in your piece. And I saw it last night, and I was both sort of just engrossed in it and scribbling notes furiously because there were so many things, like literally like words, like actual phrases and things that were almost identical at some point or another in my thought process, or material that had been in the film and then had to come out of the film. But what also struck me was how similar the process of asking and then asking again that we've both been through. And I wonder how, in addition to thinking about the families on the other sides of these murders, I wonder about your own family and the destruction that may or may not have happened there as well.
It's funny, the panel topic, or the discussion topic that it starts with, the name of it is something I've been thinking about a lot because, it's an assumption that, and our two pieces are really exploring the same notion in a way. And I've really come to be very skeptical of family. I recently watched again this film called The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On by Haruka. And at the very beginning of the film, the central figure is presiding over a wedding. And then he denounces marriage as an institution while he's presiding over the wedding. And it's something he's like this all the time, of course. He's a kind of strange antisocial figure, but also in a weird way kind of heroic. And he specifically says, well, family is the same as nations, and nationalism is wrong and it keeps people apart, and families are walls to keep people apart too. And I wrestled with that when I heard that. I kept thinking about that, and I thought, what is family? And why do we define it the way that we do? And is blood thicker than water? Is my Aunt Jean a part of my family? Or were we just coincidentally born into the same unit? And somehow I just increasingly think he's right in that we need to define family for ourselves. And what should be our family are the people that nurture us and support us and affirm us and help us, challenge us when we need to be challenged. But just because we share genes doesn't necessarily mean I've been wrestling with that question a lot, and so in the context of the piece, I thought about it a lot too. My mom is really haunted because her big sister was really important to her at a certain point, and now she's really, really ashamed of her. And so I said to her finally, well, why do you have to regard her as your sister? You should be able to choose who your sister is. I don't know, I just thought about it. But then I also thought about your family when I was watching the film again, and I kept thinking about that sort of from the opposite point of view. There's that moment when your mom's talking about needing to be comforted by your father, and that's a powerful moment in the film. And that's, I guess, that's when family has this power and this force and this need. I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny. William, Lauren, and I were really close growing up, and I talk about this mandate in the film from my parents to love one another no matter what.
Yeah.
And I think it's because the two of them both had very fraught relationships with their own siblings, and they did not want that history repeated by their own children.
Right.
But outside of the three of us, I have had a similar experience. So it's my family right now. after my mom's passing 5 years ago, and it's still incredible to me that she's been gone for 5 years. My family is my sister, myself, my partner, and then the people who we've brought into our lives over the years, who do sustain us and support us, and who are not blood relations. I don't have a relationship with my extended family.
Okay.
It's partly because I think of this notion of obligation, and partly because of this sort of relocation to New York and all the caretaking that my parents did of other people's kids, trying to straighten them out, and then, you know, at a certain point, sort of drawing a line and saying, you know what, if you can't get your kid under control, it's your problem. But I think that I think that family is, and the construction of family is it's like this puzzle, because if you're good at it, it can be the thing that carries you, right? And if you're bad at it, it can be the thing that brings you down. And I wonder, like, I was thinking, you mentioned your mom and her sister. And there's also that, there's so much shame involved in both of our stories. But, you know, they're not necessarily placed in the right, you know, they're not necessarily laid at the feet of the right people, you know. And I wonder how, you know, I know that the, you know, shame is what kept my family in silence for many years. And, you know, the shame of someone in your family being murdered and that person saying, you know, he did it in self-defense, and then never being, you know, taken to trial. You know, that's a shame that people, and a stigma that people live with for, you know, for their entire lives. But I also can't imagine the other side of it. You know, and last night during your piece, when you revealed to us that there had actually been 2 murders.
At least.
At least, I was immediately like, what on earth? Like, I asked myself, what on earth? What else, you know, does Travis's family know? Like, what other silences are there? You know, how many bodies are there? Really, and it made me think of that moment in Strong Island where I said, dredge the river and you will find him, or someone who could have been him, which was a direct, you know, connection to those kinds of anonymous murders that your piece is so eloquently and just, I mean, it's difficult for me to find the right adjective. It's almost like there isn't an adjective yet for your piece. But it's the thing that the South is about, right? It's for me, the South is about disappearance. And I just wonder how that all sort of gets expressed in this search of yours for someone whose name you know and someone whose name you don't.
It's a lot to unpack. I guess I'll come at it in sort of a roundabout way. One of the things that really struck me when I was watching your film again was that it seems like everybody in your family feels partly to blame. And I feel like almost no one in my family feels that they're to blame. And I feel like that's like this other side to trauma that we don't really talk about exactly. That the victims of the trauma are further traumatized over and over and over again with guilt and shame and a sense of responsibility. And somehow the perpetrators don't seem to have anything like that. Like, I mean, until we started digging into this, the family just moved on. But then I start thinking about these other questions, because we now know increasingly that trauma is handed down, whether it's through culture or genes even. I mean, there's all kinds of research around this question. So then I started asking myself, well, is perpetration also handed down? Is it handed down some important way? So is that in me? And that's been something I've skirted around, and I don't know how to get at. I don't know, how is he alive in me? That horrible person who was a rapist and a murderer. And I mean, the piece is already so long, there's so many things left out of it, but I mean, there's all kinds of little stories. He used to pretend to be a doctor, and he had a little medical kit, and he would disappear into the country and no one knows what he was doing. Right, so he was a sadistic nightmare for this whole community. And how does that affect me? Like, is it in me? I don't know. And then I think about moments when I can't control my temper, or when I do the wrong thing, or actually, ironically, sometimes I'll have those moments when I'm being political, when I'm on the streets and I'm doing something that I think is righteous. But I'll see an image of myself, like in the piece, there's a brief image of me at the Trayvon Martin after the Zimmerman verdict stuff, and I look at my face, and I see a little bit of that monster in me, and that I find very unsettling. I don't know.
Yeah. Wow, that's it. I've never thought about on a familial, genetic level whether or not perpetration can be passed down. I've always thought about it as a cultural thing.
Yeah.
I've never thought about it as a like grandfather to father to son,
right,
inheritance type of thing. And like, what do we inherit? And you're right. There is this sort of when civil institutions fail, right? And civil institutions, like my parents, they grew up in the Jim Crow South. My mother had to, both my parents had to take poll tests in order to vote. My mother talks about the sort of everyday violence of being black in Charleston, which hints at a larger violence that is unexpressed by her, but we know is sort of lived by her when her father is allowed to simply suffocate in the colored waiting room. There is so much trauma, I think, in the African American community because of the lack of restitution, that on some level, and I don't mean that black people or that my family blame themselves, but there is this moment when you say to yourself, it can't be everywhere, right? It can't be everywhere, because otherwise I would go out and I might hurt someone because of this omnipresent threat that I still haven't identified and I've never seen, and that I have this urge to both strike out against, but also that would feel like a betrayal of the person that my parents tried to raise all of us to be. And so, being caught in between those two places, right? The person who I think of myself as, and the urge for some sort of retribution, not wanting to betray my parents and their ideals, and not wanting to think of myself as someone who's capable of violence. The only thing that remains is shame. And shame is a really powerful, really destructive force. And I think that when I talk about my father imploding, when I got home that evening, I think that my brother's death killed both of my parents. It took 4 years to kill my father. It took 20 to kill my mother. But I think it was the same. It was the same thing. It was the power of shame and what it actually does to the body. It's just like, there's so much of the details of my brother's body in the film, because I think that one of the things that people don't talk about is how it is a corporeal experience, right? When you are shot, that's why David Green is in the film, right? Because he's the only person who can tell us what it's like to be shot. But these things get into you, and I in some sort of intense and silent moments in the middle of the night, I wonder about what my shame and my judgment of my 19-year-old self and my 20-year-old self and my 21-year-old self. I wonder what that's doing to me, right? And it's like, am I gonna have, a brain hemorrhage, a week after I'm trimming the hedges, or, spent, a great day hiking and then just all of a sudden have a headache and wake up in the ICU and be dead 20 days later. It's hard to know. It's hard to know how to be in your own body when it's informed by all of these things.
That's why I think about a lot of that stuff myself, but again from a slightly different perspective. My parents met when my father was a helicopter instructor at Fort Rucker, which is right near the town that my mom grew up in Alabama. And he was only 21 years old. He was the youngest person ever to go through Army Aviation School. He went through, he's 19 years old. And so by the time he was 20, he was already a helicopter pilot in the war in Vietnam. And he was part of a unit it was in the very early part of the war. It was 1965, 1966, when helicopter combat was experimental, and where 32 of the 54 pilots in his unit were killed. And he was very good at it. He survived it somehow, but he also did a lot of things that have haunted him his entire life. And when he returned against the war. He joined the anti-war movement, and that was a big part of what shaped my childhood and my immediate family. And then, just to flash forward, he became a physician, and he started working in family practice for a while, and he didn't like it. It didn't satisfy him. It didn't fulfill what had led him into it. Because what had led him into it were these moments in the helicopter where he couldn't help people, where people that he had fired on, and also people that were in the helicopter with him. When he got his Distinguished Flying Cross, the crew chief was killed, and he flew this helicopter that was badly damaged from artillery fire all the way back to the base and saved all these people in the helicopter. But then he's always quick to point out, when you have a conversation with him, they were hit by friendly fire. So it's like this extremely weird, contradictory thing, right? So everyone in the helicopter was killed by friendly fire, so-called friendly fire, what a weird term, right?
Yeah.
And so then he becomes a doctor. Eventually becomes a trauma surgeon. That's his specialty. Ends up working at the University of Michigan for 25 years, level 1 trauma facility. And 3 months before his retirement, he's diagnosed with this blood cancer, multiple myeloma. And so you're talking about corporeal and blood and these things. And it's hard for me to think that it's a complete coincidence that at the end of the moment when he's finishing the work that he's been doing, that was some form of salvation. I mean, there's no question in my mind. He doesn't see it that way precisely, but in my mind, and I even made a film with him about his war experiences, so I've talked to him a lot about it. That there was something, it's like the fact that it was this disease in his blood. It just seems like this kind of expression of what you're talking about, and how it's lived all of this time. And then there's these there's just little details that relate to it that just make me think about these questions a lot. There's a story which I'm not going to share because I can't at this point. He's still alive, although he's very, very sick right now. At some point in the future I will. He shared a story with me from the war that's very, very upsetting. And is the moment of shame that he had. He did something that he shared with only 2 people. He shared with his father when he came back from the war, and his father condemned him and said he was ashamed of him as his son. And someday in the future, he told me, and I don't even remember why, he's never told anyone else. He didn't tell my mom. He's told my mom everything. She thinks he's told him everything. because I know she doesn't know the story. Never told my brother. And I just think about the relationship of those experiences and that behavior to this disease. And then from, where you're coming at, you must be haunted by those questions about your own, when will it manifest itself some way? Maybe making the film helped, maybe made it worse.
Right.
I feel like my piece kind of made my internal stuff worse. It didn't give me any sense of peace or closure, or I didn't feel like I'd done anything that made anything better. You know what I mean? Every time I do it, I feel worse than I did the previous time. I felt worse last night than I did the previous time. I'm sure today I'll feel worse still. I don't know why. I never have that moment when I'm just doing a piece.
Yeah, I feel like I made Strong Island because I had to. I made Strong Island because I literally couldn't live another day in silence. And I had seen what the silence had done to my father. When my mother was still living, I saw what the silence was doing to her. She, withdrew over the years more and more into the home where I grew up, which is why we spend so much time inside of it as opposed to, a lot of verite footage outside of the home. There were years when, after my brother died, when she had a difficult time getting out of bed on his birthday. My mother's physical decline was something that crept up on us. It had started to express itself in some ways, and we know that as you get older, you lose your appetite, you have trouble sleeping. But I remember at one point in the edit, when there was a verite scene with her, I remember the moment when I realized how much her hand resembled my father's hand in the graduation footage. And his hand, his left hand by that time, was atrophied from paralysis. And my mother's hand was so thin, and her palm, the color of her palm was so pale and drained of any kind of like tint or redness or anything. I remember that moment and wondering to myself why I didn't see it then.
Yeah.
I see it in the footage, but I didn't see it. I knew she had been losing weight, but I didn't see, the signs of this really very present and real sort of eating away at her. And I do wonder how my brother's death will express itself in me.
Yeah.
And I try not to think about it too much.
Yeah.
I bought a really big life insurance policy for, because as a filmmaker, you know that, we've made tons of money over the years, and I just, it's just like, all right, if I'm really going to start this film, I've just got to, I've got to make sure that I leave something. I have to make sure that my affairs are in order.
Yeah.
And I actually went through that entire process. And I feel much more like I've fulfilled my responsibility on some level to my partner and to the people who I consider family. But I remember thinking that if making this film is going to kill me, then so be it.
Yeah.
But but I have to make it. And I wonder, and I'm not asking you to share the story because I respect that, that he's still living, but I wonder why your father chose you.
Yeah, I don't know.
I wonder if he knows that you're a storyteller and knows that at some point after he's gone.
It was a long time ago that he did it. And I can't remember whether I'd started doing creative things then. I don't remember. I don't even remember. Sometimes I wonder if I made it up. And I don't want to ask him. It's a funny thing. But I'm almost certain I did. I can't remember the specifics, but it is an interesting question. I mean, why did he? Because also, I have a very good relationship with him at this point. But my father's a very stoic man. So it wasn't like he was, it was funny so I made this film with my brother and my dad about, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago, where we just sat at the dinner table and had a conversation about war stories. As a father sharing stories of the sons. We were trying to navigate. It was really hard for me, that one as well, because I was trying to navigate, I think that the Vietnam War was a disaster. I think it was a criminal war. And so how do I navigate my deep love and respect for my father, and at the same time, in some sense, articulate this feeling that I also think the war was, which he also thinks, but he does it in a less sort of politically oriented way, and more just as sort of, I think what he took from it was that war is just a disaster for human beings, and governments betray their soldiers, and whereas I have a very specific kind of analysis of the war. And how do I navigate that, and also how do I not dare to presume to lecture my father in any way about the war? It's like something that I was really, really tense about. So we sit and we have these conversations, and we tried to navigate through it. And afterwards, my brother said, I always thought of them as being closer than my father and I were. And he said, I've never heard any of those stories before. And it was this funny feeling, because I was like, I've heard every single one of those stories before. Like, I could have repeated them. I could have told them in a sense. And then there was also stories he didn't tell. So I was very surprised by that, because they always had seemed to have a greater intimacy than he and I had. We always had a more formal relationship. Sort of weird. Especially awkward, so that's part of it. But, I don't know why. At some point that'll be something I'll have to reckon with. Why and what to do with it, and I may have to wait till my mom's gone too.
Right. How did you, I'm sort of really curious about how you began asking questions about these murders. Like, how did you, because they happened before you were born, right? I was around when my brother was murdered, so I had, at least access to my experience and the experience of my mother and the rest of my family. But how did you begin asking these questions? Because it's like, I think it's an uncommon thing for white Southerners to engage in any kind of attempts to reconcile the violence in their histories.
Yeah, I mean, I would just qualify that I think in general that violent societies and violent cultures have a hard time confronting that, actually. So I think and I think in a way that's part of what intrigued me about it and sort of compelled me to do it, is to feel like, well, this impulse needs to be a broader social impulse. I mean, I'm very concerned about the direction of our society right now, and it seems like it's going in the opposite direction. And so, it's not that I thought about that when I started. I just began to, I find that it's easier to ask questions just by being direct and trying not to skirt the issue. I mean, I feel like that if you try to soften your way into it, it usually backfires. So you just try to find a space where you can just ask some basic questions and see what the responses are. As I'm sure you know, the South is a place where people, there's things they just don't talk about. Or maybe they do, but they don't talk about it with certain people in certain circumstances. And
mixed company.
Yeah, mixed company, right? Whatever that, that can mean different things at different times. And so it was just but this is a dynamic in the family that was beyond just issues of racism and violence and patriarchy and sexual violence and all kinds of things. I mean, my grandparents, for example, so the daughter of S.E., Mary Nallis was her name, she tried to come across as a very upstanding citizen. She was always very well put together. Her house was always incredibly clean in a way my home has never been clean. She was always making sure that the meals were phenomenal. And she took these kind of formal things, it was very important to her. But, I mean, all of us knew that they also drank too much, that they would scream and yell, that they would slam doors, that she would lock herself in the bathroom with a gun and threaten to kill herself. That these were just like, this was a weekend, like this was the night. So you had the well put together woman during the week, and then on the weekend you had just this chaos. And that's another thing, by the way, that just to digress from the question, but that I find, you know, when I'm having these ridiculous moments in my own marriage, for example, where I'm acting like an idiot, or I'm being ridiculous and slamming doors and running around, you know, and then there's these moments when I'm, like, I had this conflict a year or two ago with my wife. We went through a little rough patch. We're doing great now. We sorted her shit out and got some help, but we had a period, and I remember we had this terrible argument, and I looked at her and I started laughing, and I said, we just had our Arthur and Mary Nell moment, which is the name of my grandparents. And again, it's like how these things get handed down, and you can be doing them when you know that they're wrong. Mm-hmm. That's another thing I find really, you know, like I don't really think that most of us do things for conscious reasons that we're completely aware of and then behave according to that very often. Mm-hmm. At least that's not been my experience. So anyway, when I'm trying to get into the questions, when I'm beginning to have that conversation, I don't know, I'm just trying to be direct, and I'm also trying to, like, I tend to acknowledge my own limitations, and I find that sort of helps to start conversations. I mean, if you're coming at it from a point of view that seems like you're standing in judgment, you're probably not going to get very far. Right. But if it seems like there's some sort of kind of sincerity to it, but I didn't get very far anyway, so I didn't really navigate it that well. I mean, and it was, I was shocked at, I mean, I wasn't shocked that it was hard to get people to talk to me, but I was shocked at how hard it was to get people to talk to me. It was at a level that I was surprised. Yeah. Did you?
You know what I was shocked at? I was shocked that I spent a long time reaching out to my brother's former girlfriend,
okay.
the woman whose car it actually is in the film, and I, you know, tried to convince her multiple times that it was like that I wanted to talk to her, and that I mean, the occasion of my mother's passing sort of opened, I think, a new door, because it was only after that that she replied to me.
Okay.
And I, you know, asked her about being interviewed for the film before, and she'd never replied. And after my mom died, she, you know, sent me a message on Facebook, and then it was the beginning of a conversation. You know, Alan and I eventually went down to Atlanta to interview her. And I knew that on some level that she felt that my family had blamed her for what happened to my brother. And there was a level of provocation on her part and exaggeration on her part that was intended to, you know, get my brother to try to speed up the repairs.
Okay.
Like there was, you know, definitely a, will you please check on this for me? Like, you know, sort of like, you know, boyfriend obligation thing.
Mm-hmm.
But what struck me so hard when I got to that hotel room in Georgia was how she didn't remember a thing. I think that she said, I don't remember, or yeah, I don't remember, or no, I don't really remember, dozens and dozens and dozens of times. And my line of questioning over the course of that, I don't know, around 4 hours, maybe 5, was, you know, I was trying to figure out, okay, does she think I blame her? Let's make it really clear that I don't. Okay, like, is it this? Let me make sure that I make sure, you know, that I let her know that my mother didn't blame her. You know, is it that? Is it? I mean, it was so ridiculous that at a certain point, you know, I even said to her, it was like, you need to forgive yourself for whatever it is that's holding you back, right? For whatever it is that's making you cry. You know, like there's one person who's responsible for William's death, and you're not that person.
Right.
Like, that's what I literally said to her.
Yeah.
But there was nothing that I could say
Yeah.
that would create the space for her to take the risks that the other characters in the film took, which was to confront their own feelings of guilt while still talking about what happened to William. And that's the interview that I just feel like it's the interview that got away, but I don't know if I could ever have gotten it.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that she's in a place where she wants to go back there.
Yeah.
And for me, I'm astonished that there's so little memory.
Yeah.
But then I can't make assumptions about the trauma that she, you know, may assign, or she might be living with, or the blame that she may assign herself,
Yeah.
or she may know that I do not know.
Yeah.
But she has zero memory and zero interest in talking about it.
Wow. Wow.
And that's tough, to know that there's someone in the world who knows things that you want to know,
Yeah.
and then they have them not tell you.
Yeah.
That's really tough.
Yeah.
That's really tough, to know that there's a box somewhere in a courtroom with a transcript
Yeah.
of the grand jury proceedings
Yeah.
that I can't read, to know that my brother's clothes are in a property warehouse in Suffolk County in a plastic bag marked biohazard because they're bloody or they've got whatever on them that I can't have back.
Yeah. Why will they not let you look at the grand jury proceeding?
It's secret by law.
Even, there's no,
It's secret.
does it
by
never
law.
expire?
It never expires. There have been 2 cases in New York where grand jury minutes have been released. The Rosen Rose,
Okay.
which is how we know that Ethel's brother,
Right.
was not quite truthful,
Mhm.
and that the DA, really sort of twisted his testimony.
Right.
And the other was my son, the son of the DA, who was making a film about his father and wanted to make sure that he got the portrayal of his father right. And I was like, that's really bizarre. But there's nothing else. And
And the murderer is alive?
as far as I've been able to determine, he is alive.
Mhm.
As far as I have been able to determine, he's committed insurance fraud once, I think in 2008, and he owns a house somewhere that's worth a pretty big amount of money for someone who's an auto mechanic.
Wow.
But I didn't continue to pursue him because I realized that it wasn't about him. I don't give a shit about him
Yeah.
at all.
I know what you mean.
But what I do care about is him knowing. What I do care about is saying his name,
Yeah.
and that's one of the things that struck me so hard last night during your piece. I haven't seen that say his name, say her name video in a while, but it's the naming,
Yeah.
right, that I think has so much power. And I think that if, the reason that I repeat his name so often in the film is because I don't think he gets to be anonymous. I don't think that he gets to be the unnamed character
Right.
in this story.
Right.
And I wonder how you came to connect your piece with the, Black Lives Matter, say his name, say her name piece, because it's so organic, like it's just absolutely organic. It's, organically matched. How did you come to that place?
At first it was just marking the process because these names were become, it's just like as I was going through, these killings were happening. And then there were social eruptions in response to them. And it just seemed like it was sort of marking the process in the time in a very strange way. Like it was very unnerving. Like over and over and over again, these things would happen. So, for example, I was able to make the film with the Creative Capital Award. And the day that I got the call was the day that things were erupting in Ferguson, the very day. And it was on the TV when I got the call. And Lisa from Creative Capital called me and I was kind of stunned, and I didn't sound happy. I felt ashamed, honestly. I mean, this is what was on the television, and this was the call I was getting. And you see what I was going through? I was going through this and she said, I've never heard anyone seem to be upset that they got the grant before. And I said, well, I just feel like I'm being rewarded because my relative was a nightmare and did something terrible. Like I feel like it was this so at that moment I was like, oh, these names are marking this, it's marking the journey, it's marking the process. And then as I went, I started to realize part of a marker of this erasure of people is that oftentimes all we have is the name. And then I realized that the gesture of say their name, I understood it with greater clarity because I was like, oh, it is a really sort of like an embodiment, a material embodiment of that act of violence and all of the other erasure that accompanies it. And then it just seemed strange to me that the main thing that I could carry with me was Bill Span's name. That it was just guiding me constantly. And every time I meet a Span, I immediately start talking to them in some way about it. And I do on a regular basis there's a guy who plays for the San Francisco Giants. His last name is Span, and I constantly wonder, it's like this, I'm doing the piece now, but I'm not stopping. I mean, I have a feeling this is going to continue to be a process for a long time. I don't know when it'll end exactly. It's probably part of the reason that I'm afraid to make a single channel version, is that I sort of want it to be open-ended. I mean, I would love it to be wrenched off in all other direction. When I got into Sundance with the piece we got an email the very next day from a guy who, his name is Baxley. And he is famous in Alabama because he was one of the prosecutors of, he was a prosecutor of famous acts of violence during the Civil Rights era. I'm trying to remember the specifics because that sounds all muddy to me right at this very second. And he wrote because he said, I know, I have a little bit of information about this story. And he didn't acknowledge in any way that he knew about that there was a film festival or anything like that, but it was a weird timing, and we had reached out to him a couple of years earlier and never heard back from him. So it seemed interconnected. And what he told us was a couple of things. He told us, first of all, that that he was a prosecutor in that county in the late 60s and early 1970s, and that S.E. Branch was called for jury duty and was excused from jury duty. And he can't quite remember why, but because there was, quote unquote, a history of violence. So this was he remembered this. He said, maybe I'm making this up now, but I'm really certain of that. But then he said something else. He said, my father was the prosecutor at the time of the crime. And he would have been involved in making the decision. And then he told us where he thought the grand jury reports would be. So the reason I was thinking about this too in the context of the grand jury stuff, so there probably is some kind of grand jury in that county. It's somewhere hidden away. They claim that they don't exist. We've asked them, so it's not even that they've denied them to us, it's that they said that they don't exist. But he told us that he thought where they would be, but then he also told us that he thought that there had been a new person elected, a new district attorney elected or whatever, who hadn't taken office yet, and he might be more likely to help us than the current person, so we should wait. That person has since come into office and will not help us either. And then he told us another final detail, which is that he said, that his father would have made the decision. And then my mom said, oh, that's really funny because her mother had always told her that we were related to the Baxleys. Right? So then you just get into these circles of just insanity. So is it possible, in fact, that one of the key elements was that the prosecutor was in fact a distant relative.
Wow.
But this is all information I've only gotten in the last 4 weeks, so it's, you know, it's very recent, so that I'm probably gonna go down again and try again. But that's, again, so then what you're left with? The name. You're left with the name. And it just seemed like, you know, and also, like I'm kind of obsessed with these kinds of acts of violence. I'm kind of fixated on them, I document them and I mark them. And part of what's weird to me is that you look at those names and you see how many there are, and the song is much longer than that. It's just like a little chunk of the song.
Yeah.
But then that song is only a tiny, tiny, tiny fragment in that same period, because you're talking about something like 400 people of color a year killed by police, right? 1,000 people in general. And so you hundreds and hundreds and hundreds a year. And so then you just start thinking about it. So then that issue of police violence in general has kind of fixated me for a while, because I lived in Los Angeles for almost 20 years, and Los Angeles has the longest history of some form of documentation of the numbers. The numbers are, they've tried very hard to keep the numbers kind of elusive and secret. And now there's all this crowd sort of sourcing stuff that's giving us an accurate sense. But in Los Angeles, they've had numbers pretty accurately for about 18 years now. And they're almost exactly the same every single year. They're not going up, they're the same. They have been that bad the whole time. So then I start asking, well, so is this level of violence just a stable fixture of the society, right? And then if you then extrapolate back, if it's a year of 1,000, and it's the same the year before, and the same the year before, and the same the year before, those numbers become
Staggering.
grotesque. I mean, they are fascistic, insane. I mean, they don't, you know.
Yep.
So that's just something that preoccupies me a lot. I just think about those things, you know, if we're looking at, so how many decades back are those numbers the same?
Sure. You know, it's funny you talk about numbers. New York State, as far as I've been able to tell, none of the research that we've done has managed to unearth the number of no true bills that were returned in Suffolk County in 1992. When we screened at Sundance, there was a woman who in the audience who had been with the Bronx prosecutor's office for 19 years, and she simply said to me, you know, grand juries do what district attorneys want them to do, and something very, very wrong went on here. On the federal level, in 1992, 33,000. I'll just use the flat number. It's like 33,265 or something like that. 33,000 cases went before federal grand juries. Those in that year, there were only 3 no true bills. Every other felony charge brought by the federal government over, you know, all districts of the United States, only 3 went to no true bill. And I'm sure that my brother's case may have been one of a few of the entire year in the county. And so, you know, it's the thing that I ask myself is, what was this district attorney's motive, right? I know from speaking to, and it's hard when you're asking questions and you're talking to people, and you are you're related to a victim of a crime. You know, there's this kind of like slimy, oh, I understand, oh, you're trying to make sense of things. And when I had that phone call, I was so embarrassed, and I was so ashamed of myself after I hung up with him, because he faked me out. You know, he faked me out. He was like, I understand, and I remember talking to Mom and Dad about this, and it must be so hard for you, and da-da-da-da. And it was just like, it was those moments when I was like, fuck. Like, how could I fall for it? How could I let some comforting tone of voice throw me off my game? But it's because there is still that vulnerable place where it's like, fuck, it was my fault. I should have said something. I didn't. And here's this nice white guy on the phone saying, oh, I must be like, I understand. You know, it must be so hard for you and mom and dad. And I'm so sorry, like, when did mom die? Like, he's referring to my mother as mom. You know, as opposed to Mrs. Ford, which everyone called my mother Mrs. Ford. And the one thing I took away from that conversation, and he either was lying or he said it by accident. He said to me in that conversation, you know, the position of the prosecutor's office was that your brother was killed unjustly. And so the question that I didn't ask him, because it's so difficult to navigate the space of getting information for the first time about my brother and trying to be present in that moment as a director. I didn't ask him if the theory of the prosecutor's office was that my brother's murder was unjust. Why did the grand jury return a no true bill? And he never called me again, because I had been calling everyone simultaneously. And I think when he realized that I was serious, okay, at the end of the phone call, I asked him if I could come and interview him for this film. And he was like, sure, we'll check my calendar, blah, blah, blah. And I mentioned that I had called Detective Hughes. I think that he immediately got on the phone with Detective Hughes. And I never heard from him again. I got a message from the secretary saying that he had no further information and that, you know, essentially have a nice life. And then, of course, the next time I talked to Detective Hughes, our conversation began with, so I hear that you have spoken to, and I filled in the sentence. I was like, yes, I've spoken to Stephen O'Brien, and I've spoken to Dimitri Jones. You know, so it was obvious that the three of them had spoken, and that Detective Hughes was going to be the person who interacted with me and who tried to, you know, sort of establish or re-establish the facts. But if you listen to his language, and I think that language is so important when you're talking about these things, he is not using the language of investigation. He's speaking in the language of witness statements. You know, William came at Mark Riley. It's just like, I'm sorry, is this these are your notes? Like this? You know, like, did you read the autopsy report? And did you see that there's no evidence of close-range firing? Did anybody share that autopsy report with the grand jury? Would it have not mattered at all to the grand jury? But to listen to him tell the story, it's sort of like, yeah, they were calling him a little girl. And then you begin to understand that I think that, number one, Mark Riley killed my brother because he could. It was very simple. He was a white man in Suffolk County in 1992, and you could simply kill a black person and get away with it. But number two, there was this, I think that the provocation was this sort of, you know, like having all of his friends emasculate him. And, you know, my brother went there to try to be a badass, but he embarrassed himself. He dumped a gigantic thing of nasty garage water all over him. He went there to be a bad guy, and then, you know, or a badass, and he really just came home soaking wet. Having been laughed at and egged on, and then Riley's also being laughed at and called a girl. And so, you know, for me, I think a lot about the ways in which, you know, masculinity and, you know, the defense of one's masculinity could very well be behind the reason that Mark Riley made himself visible to my brother that evening. Because he could have stayed where he was. But he came out deliberately. And that kind of, the kind of ease with which violence becomes the way that we define or defend ourselves, I think is one of the things that strikes me as, you know, with our two films having so much in common, is this sort of thread of violence and how we respond and how we use it in our lives.
Well, that issue of masculinity I think about a lot too. Through the stuff with regard to war, I just over and over again am struck that challenging someone's masculinity is often the way that you get them to carry out a war crime.
Mm.
It's very, very commonly the case. I spent several weeks with these Iraq War veterans who were involved in trying to organize a speak out around the suicide crisis that's going on within the military.
Mm.
Because even now, there's more people dying from suicide than in combat every single month. And spending all this time with them, all of these men who were, first of all, very traumatized. Second of all, had been traumatized into doing some terrible things as well, and that was a big part of their trauma too. And then watching them interact with each other and seeing the extent to which challenging one another's masculinity seemed to be central to the culture of the military.
Mm.
And it seemed to be central to the culture of convincing people to take it to the next level with violence. And I just think it's one of these things we just don't deal with enough in our society. That masculinity is a toxic thing in many ways. And it's sort of catastrophic. You can be a man without being masculine.
Right, exactly, exactly. And speaking of masculinity, also, one of the things that statement makes me think of is black masculinity.
Yeah.
And how that is, it's not toxic, but it's deadly.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
something that needs to be policed to death,
Yeah.
literally.
Yeah.
And it's even when it comes to the former president, how was he challenged? He was emasculated.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is something that happens. I mean, that's where lynchings come from.
Yeah.
Castrations are often a part of lynchings, and in the South and other parts of the country. It's not just in the South, but the policing and the defense against black masculinity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I wonder if your great grandfather might have thought of himself as doing a service. Or something like,
Yeah.
like the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, and we
Yeah.
see the rise, and we watch, Birth of a Nation,
Yeah.
and the Klan, sort of rose up to defend, white women who were being threatened by the omnipresent, dangerous black man.
Right.
And I wonder if that had anything to do with him.
Yeah, well, it's so interesting because in the book that I talk a little bit about that at the dark end of the street, which deals with the relationship of sexual violence to racism in the American South and the Rosa Parks references, that one of the points that the author of that book makes is that the presence of sexual violence against black women in the American South was a key element of domination and control, and also attacking the power of black men, because of patriarchal relations. This was one of the expressions of it. And so it's also interesting that you had a population that was actively sexually abusing another population and using it as a form of control, and then using the threat of that being done in reverse as another instigation for that violence, when in fact they were the perpetrators of that. You know what I mean? Like, it's just this grotesque cycle, but it's all deeply interconnected, and some version of masculinity is definitely connected to it as well.
Yeah. I had no idea about Rosa Parks' actual origins, and I think it's really interesting how her radical self has been written out of history.
I know, absolutely. Well, she should be the greatest civil rights leader historically. We think about the full scope of it and the things that she's done, but she's always still this kind of marginalized figure. That's very interesting. But I mean, she was politically organizing for decades. I mean, and when you think about what that must have been like to be doing that in the 1930s and the 1940s in Alabama, the level of courage, the level of, it's talking about masculinity. That's this other form of incredible courage. It's remarkable. I was scared working on my piece as a white dude right now in those towns. And the idea of being a woman in your 20s, a black woman in your 20s, and going into those towns and being fearless and asking harder questions than I was asking with far greater consequences. My goodness. I mean, I'm just in awe.
Yeah. To have that kind of bravery, I wish that I knew how to summon that kind of bravery.
Me Me too.
I really wish I knew how to summon that kind of bravery because I think, for as brave as Strong Island is, I think that there is a notch of even braver that I wish I had been able to get to, but I wasn't.
I feel like that it's very brave. I feel like it left me wishing I were braver. If that was my watch, especially when I was watching it again today. That's what I was taking away from it, is that I needed your level of bravery.
I had the same response to your work last night. And honestly, I was like, Jesus fucking Christ, I cannot believe that Travis is. I mean, when I saw Gene and the white power thing, I was like, oh my god. But is anybody out there have any questions or comments or anything? We're just sort of chatting away, assuming that you think this is interesting.
I just was curious if you might be able to speak about how you knew it was time to start this work,
To start it,
or to make this piece. You've been making work for a long time.
yeah. It really was. It really was when I was marching in the Crenshaw district, and it just seemed like I was holding a megaphone, I was handing out placards, and it just seemed like that I was being dishonest unless I tried to address something that was so similar in my own family history. It was that whole day. It was a very, like, those several days, because I was the night of the verdict. We immediately went down, and I used to be quite politically active. I have taken sort of a break, unfortunately, and I need to get back into, like, when everyone else is becoming political is what I'm suddenly focused on. It's a very weird moment. But, and so I created these little placards and printed them off and stapled them together, and then borrowed some bullhorns and just went into the main neighborhood where I knew people would be gathering. And just started handing things out, and the first day was just this kind of spontaneous thing, and then the next day went back, and the demonstrations were very, very large, and it was that second day when I just felt like that it was something that I was in the back of my mind for a while, but I just knew there was no way that I could avoid it anymore. I had to deal with it directly. And then that began the process. Like I said, I feel like for some reason after last night and our conversation, I feel like going back down in a couple weeks and just seeing what happens now. Like I've had some time to digest it and put together what I have so far. I want to go meet with Baxley. I had hired a private investigator, and that whole thing, I could make a whole movie about that. Honestly, I really think the guy might have been like a Klansman or something, like, and was like playing games with me and fucking with me the whole time. There's just so many weird little details, and I kind of feel like I need, we're talking about courage and wanting, so I feel like, well, all right. Last time I left, I was like, I don't ever want to go back. I'm done. And now I kind of feel like I want to go back again. I'm sure that my wife, who's going to give birth within the next 3 weeks, will love this particular plan, and I'm sure she'll be thrilled. Talking about people liking to listen to us talk, I cannot tell you how many times my wife says, "Would you shut up?" A lot. It's like we're chatty in our family. So, like, that's one, we're talking about things that come through the generations. One thing that I realized when I go to Alabama is, everyone talks as much as we do. Like, that's where that comes from. So.
I am not talkative at all. I'm a poor communicator, and I'm married to my partner for 21 years. Is a Jewish New Yorker, and Jewish New Yorkers love to talk, and I have just been like pulled, like kicking and screaming into the world of adult communication because my partner is just like, no, you can't sit there and not say anything. You just can't, and you're not moving until you speak. So having that experience, and also just breaking out of the silence of the last 25 years, it's been a learning experience for me, for sure. And the thing that I won't go back to is actually the house where I grew up.
Okay.
Like many African Americans, my family's house is in foreclosure, and the banks are, even though I tried to keep it away, I tried to forfeit it, I tried to give it to Habitat for Humanity. I tried, and I finally was just like, I can't keep going out to the house and taking care of it because it's empty, it's
Wow.
gone.
Wow.
My family doesn't exist here anymore.
Yeah.
And so there is a really nice split ranch house in the suburbs in a terrible school district that is waiting for some other family to write its story in it. But the thing that actually I'm dealing with is not so much the release of the film, but it's the release of the house
Wow.
and letting that go and having to sever the urge to return
Wow.
to that place because it's not, it's meaningless to me now.
Yeah.
Um,
I felt the power of that space in the film. I thought about that a lot.
yeah,
You really captured that. I guess that's the way it'll exist.
indeed.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure, Travis.
Yeah, likewise.
Really.